Hey, what's going on guys, Nitro here and welcome to this Guinness World Record 2014 gaming series. And I thought what better way to kick off this brand new series here on You Always Win, just as we're entering the next generation of gaming content, than to go over it all and have a recap of the previous generations and find out exactly what was the best of the best. The king of the first ever generation of gaming consoles was the Magnavox Odyssey, which sold 330,000 units. Now we're talking about the mid-70s for this one, so for that point in time that's a crazy number of units to sell. The second generation of gaming consoles from 1976 to 1984 saw the arrival of the Atari 2600. Now we're talking color games, joysticks, fancy wooden paneling on the console by this point. We really are into the future of gaming right here. The Atari was in fact the first ever console to use cartridges to store the games, and it sold a staggering 27.6 million units worldwide. The third generation was the rise of Nintendo with the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES, which was the first ever 8-bit console. Now it was also the first console to use a gaming control pad, which it's the same format that we follow today really, so it's lasted a long time with the D-pad, the buttons, the start select, and even the controller itself is now kind of a global icon, along with Mr. Mario himself, as this was the first time we were introduced to the Mario Man himself. As I said, Nintendo dominated this generation with a crazy 61.9 million units sold worldwide. 1987 saw the beginning of the fourth generation of gaming consoles with the introduction of the SNES, or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which was the first ever 16-bit console. Now we also saw the arrival of the Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive depending on where you lived, and that also sold 40 million copies, which was just short of the Super Nintendo sales for that generation of 49.1 million units, which is not quite as much as the NES sold at 61, but still pretty impressive nonetheless. The fifth generation of console gaming was the rise of the 3D games that we all know and love today. Now the quick to render high quality 3D graphics was a much bigger improvement on previous generations, and probably the biggest step up between any two generations I can think of. Now, although this generation was completely dominated by the arrival of the original PlayStation with such games as Final Fantasy VII and Gran Turismo, the original one, which was, I think, still to this day probably one of my most played games of all time, the amount of time I put into that game. And although it was completely dominated by the PlayStation, it was actually the first console to sell over 100 million units, selling a total of 104 million units worldwide. I think it's only fair to give a mention to the Nintendo 64 in this generation too, because it was the first ever gaming console which was a 64-bit, and the first ever console to feature built-in 4-player use. The sixth generation began in 1998 with the Sega Dreamcast, which turned out to be a kind of a flop in the end, selling only 10 million units, which unfortunately saw Sega abandoning all hardware stuff, and they luckily continue to focus on the software side of things, so we do see games like Sonic still around, which is a good thing. And it's unfortunate they don't make consoles anymore, because they did play a big part in previous generations. However, this generation probably turned out to be one of the most important generations of gaming so far, and the reasons that we play games the way we do today, in fact. Now, this generation saw the introduction of the PlayStation 2, which is still to this day the biggest selling console of all time, with 157 million units sold worldwide. And it also saw the introduction of the Microsoft Xbox, the original one, and the introduction also of online gaming. Oh yeah! The seventh generation of consoles truly was the generation of record breakers, seeing Microsoft's Xbox 360 be the first ever HD console, along with Sony's PlayStation 3 being the first ever console to support Blu-ray. And also the Xbox 360's Kinect became the fastest ever selling gaming peripheral, selling just under a million with 933,000 units sold in its first 60 days of release. However, the real champion of this generation came out of the blue. It's a blast from the past with Nintendo, and the introduction of the Wii, selling a crazy 100 million units, blowing both Microsoft and Sony out of the water with this one. So there we have it guys, that brings us up to date with what I guess we can no longer call the next generation. We're in the current generation, the 8th generation of gaming consoles, and it'd be interesting to find out who comes out on top on this one, how it plays out. But what I'm really interested to know is, Which generation did you guys become involved in gaming during? Which was your favorite generation? What was your best game during that generation? And if anything, what was your favorite game of all time? Interested to find out? Leave it in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, I'll see you later.